Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest webinar. So today we're going to talk about GDPR compliance in the context of application modernization. And I have the pleasure to introduce you to a couple of speakers. So we're going to have Dosanjh, Solution Architect at Quali.
Hello.
And Gary Wilson, Technical Manager in the EMEA region.
Hello.
So let's go ahead and get started. Just a few words about Quali. We're a venture-funded startup company based in Santa Clara, California. Our main solution is a software platform, orchestration platform, delivering dynamic self-service test environments. And we have about over 150 Fortune 500 customers among different verticals, and about 115 employees in different regions of the world. So let's talk about our agenda today. So Gary is going to introduce us to GDPR and specifically in the context of application development. And then Dos will go over an application certification approach through a case study and a demo as well. And finally, we'll end up with Q&A and wrap up. So Gary, this is all yours.
Okay, thank you, Pascal. The main purpose of the Global Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, is to provide greater power and protection of data privacy for all EU citizens. Unlike current directives, it will become EU law on the 25th of May of this year. And one of the key changes is that it will affect all organisations processing personal data of EU subjects, but regardless of where they are located. And any data breaches, such as system hacks, must be notified to the relevant authorities within 72 hours and not hidden for weeks or even months. There will be potentially heavy penalties for those organisations who do not comply with this. EU subjects will have new rights to know what data is held about them and can request to have it deleted. Organisations will have to be proactive in terms of ensuring that data is protected by designing systems and the development processes to minimise access to private data. And lastly, before such data is processed and accessed, privacy risks will need to be analysed. Okay, next slide. So why has all this effort gone into GDPR? Why do we need a new law? Firstly, there have been some very high-profile cases reported in the press over recent years with serious breaches of personal data. One of the first serious breaches concerned the UK tax authorities over 10 years ago. It may not have constituted a technology failure or system hack, but something as simple as media being carelessly mislaid. In relative terms, only 25 million records were involved, but back in 2007, this was serious news. Moving forward 4 years, a breach at Sony involved millions of records globally, which was a landmark for its time. And in more recent years, perhaps the largest breach was a reported 3 billion user accounts hacked at Yahoo. Not only was the scale truly massive, but equally worrying, this was not reported for around 2 years to the outside world. The authorities in the EU also recognise that the current DPD directive has several weaknesses that need to be plugged. Even if organisations are based outside the EU, they should still be held accountable if they deal with private details of EU citizens. Experience has clearly shown the authorities need to wield a big stick to ensure rapid notifications of data breaches. The right to have personal data deleted has also been extended to include published web data. And now you have to design in data privacy into new systems and dev testing practices. New slide. So what are the key implications from a GDPR compliance point of view when developing and maintaining enterprise applications? Well, affecting all parts of the dev process and the resulting system itself, you'll now have to design privacy in. This will be time consuming and demanding for new greenfield applications, but for existing applications undergoing maintenance, it will be even more of a challenge. First and foremost, prevention is much better than cure, as they say. So it's no surprise to hear that organizations are now heavily invested in the areas of security and cyber testing in order to avoid data breaches in the first instance. A key part of this is ensuring that test environments are realistic and accurately reflect what is in production. And the next consideration is being able to show compliance of dev and testing processes. A key part of this is so-called data minimization, i.e. restricting access to personal data wherever possible. Data masking and obfuscation is clearly a long-standing technique, but it's equally important to be able to show auditability both internally and to the authorities when necessary. Okay, back to you, Pascal.
Thanks, Gary. So as Gary just told us, GDPR is not only a hot topic, but it's going to create a lot of burden for organizations, and not just organizations in the European Union, but organizations that have to deal with any data related to European Union citizens. So this is creating a large burden and overhead that is impacting not just greenfield application, but all existing application in place. Legacy applications and brownfield development are also concerned. So how do these organizations really are going to be able to meet those challenges and still being able to accomplish a proper application velocity? And this is going exactly in the opposite direction as this trend of continuous testing and accelerating application releases. So if you look at the traditional project timeline, you would have a very essentially linear path of progress from the development to unit testing to procurement of dev test resources, eventually most of the testing happening right before release to production. And obviously now with continuous testing and agile development, the major trend is to shift left all these testing cycles and have a very short iterations of testing very early in the development cycles, and so that you have continuous feedback and you minimize most of the bugs that could happen in production, so that you spot them before production. So right now, essentially in the balance, we have on one hand a mandate to release fast your application using agile development, and on the other hand, we have all those new compliance regulations, and actually some of them are not new, but this one specifically GDPR is something that's not just a directive, but a regulation that's going to concern a majority of large global companies. And so in order to meet these challenges of essentially accomplishing both, not compromising on compliance to become more agile, or the other way around, we have automation. And automation is going to be the primary vehicle for this. And this is going to happen before you release to production early in the cycle. And so how do we do that? This is something that Das is going to share with us through a case study. So Das.
Thank you, Pascal. And what we'll discuss here in the case study is an example of how financial organizations can actually modernize their application and still adhere to the GDPR and other compliance requirements. So we'll step through both a case study and a demonstration. And in this example, we'll have an organization, a fictitious organization that we've identified as Bank of the ALPS. And we'll go ahead and step through the initial strategy that this institution, Bank of the ALPS, is looking to employ. So the very first thing that they want to address is in line with their business strategy. As any business organization, they are always looking for ways to improve their services, the products that they offer, and that is part and parcel of how they improve a customer experience, whether it's in the bank facility or financial institution, or if it's an online experience. And in this case, Bank of the ALPS wants to also reach to the new generation of millennials with engagement strategies that allows them to use their products and services with the tools that they're familiar with. Part of that is also the trust that these organizations are looking to establish. And in the case of Bank of the ALPS, they don't want to just provide transactions. They want to provide a richer experience along with advice and using new capabilities that technologies provide to have better services tailored. And now that the person is not just getting canvassed with new offerings, but it's really something that they are interested in. With that is the management and securely storing that data and the information that those folks are sharing with them. So that trust is vital. So let's go ahead and take a look at how Bank of the ALPS is going to modernize a financial loan application. The key directive here is not to compromise with the security and compliance components that they have to adhere to. So we'll walk through this. On the left-hand side, you'll see external end users. Those could be classified as remote employees that need access to the application. And then your bank customers that have access via different devices, desktop, mobile, so on and so forth. We also have then at the bottom internal end users. Those are the internal employees that have to access the application for conducting their business. Some are authorized to access certain compartments of the application, and others are only allowed to have significant views where applicable to them. The banking application itself is identified in the middle with a logon screen. And on the right-hand side is the requirement for modernization. The very first thing that Bank of the ALPS is looking to do is to develop this using a native distributed architecture. They need to go to cloud. They want to make sure that the cloud model is localized for in-country resources to make sure that their risk profile is not mitigated across different geographies. So they really want to have a localized distributed architecture within their geography. Number two is the importance of having third-party tools, in this case, software as a service tools for customer relationship management, where they can now import the customer data, run queries, run reports, and really speed up that process of supplying the right applications for those customers. And the third thing they want to make sure that they adhere to in this modernization requirement is to preserve functionality, make sure the performance is in place, while they support security and regulatory compliance laws like GDPR. So let's take a look at the solution design for this particular application. And Bank of the ALPS has selected AWS, Amazon Web Services in this case, to host their application. They've selected three components that they're going to modernize. The presentation tier will use the Apache Web Server. The application tier will use the IBM WebSphere. And then we'll have a database tier, which was represented by the Oracle stack there. The integration with the SaaS application is identified as Salesforce for their customer relationship queries and management. So the challenges, as you can imagine, is how do you incorporate a data privacy regulation and adhere to it without delaying the business process? So what we've understood from various industry reports is that the average industry delay is about 8 weeks. So to take something that's a product or a service and make that available to enhance that customer experience that we were referring to, if you're delayed by at a minimum of 8 weeks and it's going to take you longer, that's a huge impact to your competitive advantage. The second part of that is the challenges around cost. Any kind of data breach, attack, or loss can translate to costly, not only legal actions and a loss of customer trust, but your brand gets really damaged with the ongoing services that you want to offer. And the penalties, specific with the GDPR, can be up to 4% of your global revenue. So very significant, both in the context of delay and cost. So an approach as you look to certify your application, to get it modernized, and then how do you actually have a methodology where you can then subscribe to a workflow that allows you to get from the initial assessment phase, which we're talking about here in the inventory and modeling, where an infrastructure and an application owner can take an assessment of what they're trying to accomplish, what needs to be protected, and they have now the ability to model that with drag and drop tools, make sure they have the right databases and applications, model correctly, and align that with the services that they're trying to offer. You then want to get into a design mode where, in this case, we've identified it as the blueprint designer. And that's where you can now utilize the self-service catalogs and really start to articulate your design in a fashion that meets your modernization requirements. You then get into the blueprint consumption, where you're actually deploying your design now for testing and validation and making sure that third-party test tools that you incorporate meet the requirements that you're trying to address. And then finally, as you look for optimization and you look at the analytics and the business intelligence results, the infrastructure and application owner now has a baseline of what's working and how they can improve upon that. Or if something's not effective, where do they remediate those types of requirements? So the ROI can be calculated here, and now you can understand how you can increase the velocity of deploying your application. So let's take a closer look at Quali CloudShell. And we're going to introduce this in 3 phases. The top phase there that you'll see is the interface. How do you actually access the management interface? There's various components that you can utilize, from plugins to how you can automate some of this connectivity using your identity management tools. Once you're into the application of CloudShell, you have specific environments that you can set up, and we've identified those as blueprints. You can set up your architecture, your applications. They can be virtual, physical, the different services you want to bring in. You can really mix and match what your business requirements dictate. And at the bottom there is the features. You get specific into what you need to model, what you need to automate, and how you can then create an automation and catalogs around this. So you don't have to do manual tasks each time. You can now just start creating templates and then utilizing those templates in an automated fashion. Where you can deploy these templates and blueprints are in any number of public and private and even hybrid type of cloud models, which we've highlighted a few on the right, anywhere from OpenStack to Google to Amazon Web Services. So in the case of the example that we're referencing here for Bank of the ALPS, we've got the blueprint components identified for the loan application that we referenced earlier. And so we're going to design those components utilizing the various application tier, database tier. We're using a virtual infrastructure within Amazon Web Services. We're going to integrate with the SaaS application, in this case, Salesforce. And then we're going to introduce 3 test tools: BlazeMeter for some of the initial tests around load and performance, White Hat for vulnerability scanning, and then Source Labs to make sure that the feature and functionality are adhering to our requirements. And this is all going to be deployed within a public cloud identified here as Amazon Web Services. So the way this is going to be deployed according to that workflow that I identified earlier is we're going to use dynamic test environments. And these test environments are categorized for their respective criteria. The first criteria or feature functionality test is identified in sandbox number 1. And here we have that template that we had modeled. We've deployed that architecture. We've got the integration points in place. And now we're going to introduce the feature functionality tests that have been prescribed and now executed within that sandbox. Once that sandbox is accomplished and passed all the requirements, we take that template and then introduce that into sandbox number 2, to where now we expose it to security and compliance tests. We've identified the initial vulnerability tests here with White Hat Security, but you can also introduce other scripts and other customized tests to validate and certify that whether it's data protection, data masking, data storage or access, or any number of security compliance tests that you want to introduce can be administered in sandbox number 2. Once that has been successfully completed, you can take that approved template into sandbox number 3, and now you can start to administer load and performance tests. In this case, we're using BlazeMeter, and you can use a variety of test scripts to look at continuous load, start-stop requests, file uploads, things of that nature that would mimic a customer experience. So together, you've got a comprehensive test, a methodology that allows you to get from sandbox 1 all the way through sandbox number 3, and now you can certify your loan application. Part of that certification process is to incorporate that with a DevOps continuous integration pipeline. So you may have a number of tools that you may utilize as far as how you package your builds and how you deploy them into production environments. And this continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline allows you then the integration touch points with the Quali sandboxes to introduce the right packages as we had referred to in the previous slide. So in sandbox number 1, you can get the right packages in place to do that functional load, security, integration, staging, production, all the way through the workflow, and make sure that you have the right builds, the right process, and the right infrastructure in place to make sure that those tests are conducted successfully. So that's a key part of making sure that the automation is in place once you've set up the initial workflow. So in the context of meeting GDPR compliance with these dynamic test environments, I want to make sure that 3 key areas are really elaborated upon. The number 1 key that I want to touch upon is data minimization. One of the benefits of using these dynamic environments is that they're time-bound. They're isolated from each other, so what you do in the first sandbox, for example, with feature functionality, is isolated from what you do in the security sandbox. The data that you introduce in the first one is different, or it could be the same as the data used in the second one, but it's really up to you. The key being data minimization. Once you reset an environment, that data is no longer active in those sandboxes. So the orchestration that provides that automated teardown is key as far as the repeat and how quickly you can then test something in case that you had to make a change to the code, a change to a script, or if there's some application nuances that you had to address, those can be quickly introduced, and that data is not going to impact as far as data duplication, things of that nature. That's a key area that the dynamic test environments provide. The auditing is also another area of importance where the management and the visibility of an audit trail of that data is critical. One of the key directives of GDPR is to make sure that not only as a customer that is submitting their data for use within these environments in this application, that they can then access that as an audit log, if you will. So having a consistent audit trail that can be referenced at later times is also key. And the third one is the dynamic test environments are replicas of production. This is a key statement. There are a one-for-one replication of a production environment. What we often see is dynamic test environments may not have a one-for-one representation. Therefore, when that solution is put into production, it runs into all kinds of challenges because they've overlooked some of the subtleties that can surface when you're in production. So that's a key differentiation. And together, all 3 of these meet the compliance requirements for GDPR, at least to get you into that context. So let's go ahead, and with that case study design, we'll actually look at a demonstration to where we now can go into this dynamic environment. I'm going to go ahead and navigate into a web interface. We've got an active login into the CloudShell blueprint screen here. And on the initial login, what you'll note is based upon your user profile, you will only see certain criteria that is permissible to your persona. So if you're an administrator, obviously you get administrative view. If you're a particular end user, you may have restrictions based upon which department and which function that you are responsible for. As an example, you may be only responsible for network, IT, or cybersecurity, or app modernization components. So that's really the initial step that you want to look at. The next thing is what we'll do is go into the Bank of the ALPS blueprint, and we'll go ahead and select that. And what you'll note here is, if you recall, we talked about the design and the modeling. So from our initial assessment, we did an assessment and a plan, and that plan had this design model. So we talked about a 3-tier architecture, and we'll jump to the center where you'll see that there's a bank of the app application, which has on the left-hand side Apache Web Service for its UI, and at the bottom it'll have the Oracle databases. So that's the modernization of those 3 tiers within the Amazon Web Services. On the right-hand side, you'll see the integration with Salesforce, so for the CRM application. And what we've introduced at the top is a semantic CASB device, which is a cloud access security broker, which does data encryption and data masking capabilities. On the left-hand side, we have 3 different test tools that we've referenced earlier: Sauce Labs, White Hat, and BlazeMeter, which are all being accessed through an elastic load balancer for the application interfaces. So this is our design model. This is our blueprint, essentially where we're going to conduct those 3 test criteria. So the next thing we're going to do is deploy this particular model. And what you'll see is in the deployment, you will have certain options. First is the schedule. You'll notice that this is time bound. So you as an administrator or the person conducting this test that has an understanding that the data that's going to be incorporated in this test will only be utilized for 2 hours. So everything will be reset after that. At the bottom, we have different values that we can select from encryption for the first one. The second one, we can use tokenization. Then the third one, we can use the latest build number. So this gives you options as far as which schemes from a data masking, which builds meet your requirement to make sure that GDPR is going to be met. So we'll go ahead and we'll deploy this, and then we'll come to a deployed version that is already active in our environment. And essentially what this does is deploy the nodes in the environment that we were referring to. And the setup will show that these active nodes are being deployed, that they're being set up, that they're now being connected, as well as configured. So any custom configuration, any connectivity requirements are being administered during this setup cycle. And you can note that as each of these devices become deployed, they'll change from a gray identifier to a green identifier, which then shows that they are in an active state. So let's go ahead and look at an actively deployed sandbox for Bank of the ALPS, utilizing that last blueprint. And here, as I had mentioned earlier, you now have these green identifiers that show that the resource is online, is powered on, and is accessible. So one of the things that you'll note is that they have IP addresses. So that means we can not only show that connectivity is established between them, but we can also show that the activity for a particular device. So if we go ahead and look at the actions and then look at how we can actually connect to a particular one, we can then custom configure any type of requirements for that particular node. So if we go ahead and SSH, here's an example of a login screen. So we can actually go ahead and custom configure each one if there are subtle nuances. At the same time, we can go ahead to one of the test scripts and either, for example, in the BlazeMeter one, we can go ahead and select it. And then at the bottom, you'll see we can start traffic and we can wait for the traffic to finish. So we can automate some of these activities to run the test to make sure that once this environment is established, we can actually then automate the execution of tests. So we don't have to wait for manual inputs, and we can then obviously pass from stage 1, stage 2 to stage 3 as we conduct these tests. Key here also is an audit log, an audit trail of the activities. So you can actually see when things were started, when things were set up, if there was any configuration tweaks done to it and by whom. And so you'll have an output of activity which can be referenced at a later time. So anybody that comes in and makes any changes, you will have accessibility to that activity. So that's also very key in this particular environment. The last thing we want to show here is that once you've conducted your test, that you can end this sandbox by hitting this button and selecting OK. And now the teardown process is initiated. What this teardown process introduces is that data minimization that we referred to earlier. So data is reset, is actually wiped out. The next thing is that connectivity is no longer active. Those IP addresses and those network connections between those nodes are discontinued. The third step is the nodes are actually torn down themselves. So there is no reference or no footprint to that node ever being existing except in audit logs. So that really is key as you wipe clean the sandbox from a deployed to an inactive position. So with that, let's go ahead now and look at a summary of the Bank of the ALPS GDPR application modernization requirement. The requirements from going from a manual process, from a static, old school, monolithic, on-premise architecture, which was subject to data breaches, which were non-compliant for GDPR. And then by utilizing the Quali CloudShell solution, we were able to design, model, deploy, test, and validate, and then repeat that in an automated fashion. So the automated workflows were in place. We had distributed architecture, which was supported not only within Amazon, but with third-party application integration with Salesforce. And then we made sure that by introducing tokenization and encryption that we were protecting those data objects and those fields within the application to meet GDPR compliance.
All right, thanks, Das. I think that was very insightful and very interesting approach with tons of best practices here. So if you want to learn more about Quali and the CloudShell platform, we have a couple of ways for you to get educated. One of them is to ask for a technical demo, which is a simple 30-minute web conference. The other way is also we have a free trial, so you can, if you are more the type of a person who like to experiment, with hands-on, you can register and sign up for a free trial. And you can also contact us at info@quali.com for any additional questions. We also have some references along the same topic. There's a white paper you can download, as well as a demo, a short demo, similar to the one that Doug did today. And there's also a chat talk video that's going over some of these best practices. So let's say that I'd like to go over a few Q&A that I see were submitted during the course of this presentation. So the first one I think will be for Das. Can this solution support an on-prem data center and private cloud? So it seems like it's coming from a company that's maybe not ready to use public cloud resources. So Das?
Sure. That's a great question. What you find is, specifically in this area of application modernization, a lot of companies want to keep their data, want to keep their application on-prem, are very hesitant to go to cloud. And what they've done is a lot of data masking capabilities within their on-prem or private cloud environments. The challenge of going to a public cloud, and especially with SaaS applications where you don't control the app, you have to rely on third-party tools to protect that data in the application. So now you're relying on API-driven solutions for CASB vendors like cloud access security brokers that exist in the cloud. A lot of organizations, specifically what Pascal, what the question is asking, in Europe, they want to keep that application on-prem in a private environment. So that means you have to use an inline CASB vendor to protect and mask that data. That can get very challenging in the deployment because, as a lot of you know, sometimes it can take 6 months to pass an enterprise review board for any organization. Therefore, you have to go into a multi-mode deployment. Which pieces can be put in the cloud, which in a hybrid mode, which ones can be kept on-prem in a private, which can actually take advantage of public. So the beauty of this is you can use Quali CloudShell to model each one of those, and based upon your risk tolerance of your data protection officers, you can now have an option of which one meets your business requirements.
Thanks, Das. The next question, I think, is for Gary. Gary, what type of penalties we could face with non-compliance to GDPR?
Okay, thanks, Pascal. I think Dos could have touched on this briefly during one of his slides, but the stated maximum fines could be as much as 20 million euros or 4% of the annual global revenues, and that's whichever is the highest. So we're not expecting that to be fairly common, and of course people will and organizations will strive to avoid such penalties, particularly with reporting to the authorities within the complied 48 hours of any data breaches. But they are the stated maximums that companies could potentially be fined going forward.
All right, thank you. Next question is for Das. So can this process that you went over today be applied to other types of certifications or regulations?
Absolutely. That's a great question, because what you'll find is we're just at the starting point of data protection and data regulations. So to be applicable to other regulations, whether they're industry specific, I'll cite an example here in the United States called one for healthcare. It's called HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And that describes data protection requirements for patient information. There are other regulations like payment card industry or PCI compliance for the retail and financial transactions, as well as country specifics like Personal Information Protection Electronic Document Act in Canada. And so as you look at these different regulations, the reason why I specifically raised that one in Canada, they said no data can leave their geography. So you have to use tokenization methods, whereas in HIPAA and PCI, you may be able to utilize encryption methods. So the beauty of the CloudShell solution is it allows you to test and model and design various subtleties and configurations to meet these requirements. And it can be industry specific, country specific, and geographic specific. So that's really where you can extend not only what you're doing for GDPR, but for any regulation that comes forward in the future, as well as it exists today.
All right, thanks. Yeah, this is very, very interesting. So I don't think we have any more questions at this time. So I want to thank Gary and Das for sharing their expertise on the topic, and I hope you enjoyed this webinar as much as I did. So thanks everyone for attending.